One issue that you raised in terms of how the corporations and bank profits have recovered tremendously, and many of these companies are sitting on huge piles of cash that rather than invest in new machinery or bring in new workers, they're just sitting on their money and presumably investing it because they're not going to put it in at the bank rates or CD rates. So they're obviously investing the money that they have rather than create those jobs.
Well, even more interesting, and maybe a bit of a shock to folks who don't follow this, what the corporations are doing when they hold back the money because it's not profitable for them to hire, in large part is they lend it to the United States government to fund these deficits. The United States government refuses to tax corporations and the rich. It then runs a deficit. It spends more than it takes in because it's not taxing them. And here comes the punchline. It then turns around to the people it didn't tax, corporations and the rich, and borrows the money from them, paying them interest and paying them back. If the United States wanted to stimulate our economy in an effective way...
Paying them tax-deductible interest.
Right, also. But if the government really wanted to do something, go get the money from them, stimulate, which will help them, and if you tax them to do it, you wouldn't have a national debt. You wouldn't run a deficit. We're running a deficit because the people who run this society would like us to deal with our economic problems, not by taxing those who have it, the way we used to, but instead by endlessly borrowing them. And now the ultimate irony. We've borrowed so much as a nation from the rich and the corporations, they now are not so sure they want to continue to lend to us because we're so deeply in debt, and they want us instead to go stick it to poor people and sick people instead. It's an extraordinary moment in our history as a nation.
People are sending us in questions. There is, as Richard Wolff says, an enormous hunger to understand all this. Eli Rivers on Facebook asks, given how the masses are getting continually and increasingly financially punished for events they had little or nothing to have caused, is it reasonable to assume there will be major political upheavals in the near future? It seems we're almost at a breaking point. Professor Wolff.
Yes, I think in a sense, that's coming here in the United States. Your previous guest explaining the gaps in wealth among the people becoming more and more extreme. The signs are everywhere of a society like ours polarizing in a way that is going to undercut assumptions about what it means to be an American, expectations about realizing an American dream. Those things are falling away, and people have to face that, and they're upset. I think part of what we call the Tea Party is simply an expression, not so much of this or that ideological persuasion, but of a level of upset about economics and the future for their own children that makes people look somewhere for something. Europe also, I think, shows us the future. In Europe, where people are more organized in trade unions, in socialist, communist, and other political parties, there are vehicles that these institutions provide for public anger and public disagreement to be voiced in a reasonable and consistent way. In all the major countries of Europe, not just Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and those that are in trouble, but in France and Germany and so on, there have been massive public actions in the streets showing that people do not want, to use one of the slogans in France, do not want the costs of an economic crisis to be borne by the mass of people who didn't cause it and who have already suffered from it. And that has to stop. And that is shifting European politics. And while we don't have the level of organization of people in this country that they do, I do think we will build them again. We will rebuild them from what they were before, because there has to be a change from the very direction that the questioner asks, and I'm sure that's coming.
But in Europe, you have the remarkable situation that the more conservative parties are being pressured by the street to adopt more conciliatory policies in terms of dealing with the crisis. Whereas in the United States, the more liberal parties are seeing no pressure from the street, are increasingly moving to the right in terms of how they see the need to deal with the crisis.
It's a wonderful case study. The German example is probably the best one. The biggest economy in Europe, the most important, run by a woman now named Angela Merkel, who runs that society. She did a remarkable thing over the last 2 months. She said there will be no bailout of Greece unless banks are made to pay a part of the cost. Other governments in Europe didn't have the courage. Why is this woman, a conservative, wanting to make sure the banks pay? Because she lost the last 3 by-elections, and the critics of her are saying your political career is over if you don't stop making everyone in the society pay, except those who, A, caused this crisis, and B, have been bailed out by the government to this point. So she actually changes, and I think that's a sign that the pushback from masses of people, which will take many different forms, is already underway there and will come here.
Why are people in the United States so different?
I think it's the question of organization. Over the last 50 years, we, the collective American people, have let the organizations that express mass concerns about economics atrophy. We're at the end of a 50-year decline of our trade union movement. We don't have the kinds of political parties we used to have in this country and that were very powerful in this country. And so we don't have the vehicles to articulate, express, and bring political force to the way people feel. And so they go wherever there's a little bit of organization, Tea Party, even if it's a little strange and a little outside their frame, because it's something. I think the message of other people will be, if we can form the kinds of organizations that articulate these positions, there are a lot of people out there ready, willing, and able to become part of that.
This is another question from Facebook. Steve Cipolla asked, does it continue to make sense to refer to U.S. economic policy in isolation? Isn't the real long-term threat to economic and political stability the persistence of increasing global income inequality?
Yes, but we are still dealing with corporations that have their bases, most of them, here in the United States. Are they more global than ever? Yes. Is that a serious problem? Absolutely. You know, 30, 40 years ago, we spoke about corporations moving production jobs out of the United States. 10 or 15 years ago, we began to talk about outsourcing, moving white-collar jobs out. The most recent addition to that is the decision of corporations as they look around the world to say, you know, the growth of our market, the growth of demand, it's in Asia, it's in Latin America, it's in parts of, it's not here. The American people are exhausted, their wages are going nowhere, we have high unemployment, and the fact is no one's going to lend them much more money because they're tapped out. So they're not a growing market. So you see American corporations literally focused for production and for consumption elsewhere. That means they're going to take care of themselves in the world. And if we don't want to be left behind, if we don't want the United States to become a backwater, then the freedom of corporations to do what they want has to be reined in. And that's a difficult issue for Americans to confront and deal with. And we live in an ideology in which we're supposed to believe that what corporations choose to do will magically be the best for all of us. It hasn't worked that way. That's why we are where we are. Basic change is the order of the day.
And in other regions of the world, that change is occurring. We've covered quite extensively here on Democracy Now! The changes in Latin America, where actually the income and the wealth gap is shrinking in the past decade for the first time in the memory of the political establishment of Latin America as a result of all of the socially oriented governments that have come to power. Right. It's a completely different path from what's going on here in the United States.
And I think it also speaks to our situation, because before that happened, before you had Evo Morales, before you had Chavez, before you had, and whatever you think of their particular policies, you had an upswelling of people saying the status quo that has got us into this dead end is not tolerable, and they developed new organizations, they rebuilt old organizations, and suddenly basic changes in policy, which reined in the power of private enterprise, which said that capitalist enterprises are not the be-all and end-all of how to run a society. Those kinds of movements attracted millions of people, gained political power, and there really is no reason to believe that our society is immune or unable to do in its own way, in its own traditions, something similar.
Well, I want to ask you about another question. Brian Clifford asked on our Facebook page, in the current moment, people in liberal democratic states seem to have internalized capitalism as a natural and unquestionable order. How does the left rupture such subjectivities?
Good question. You know, again, it's our history. For 50 years, it has been unacceptable politically in the United States to ask what is basically a straightforward question. We have a particular economic system. It's called capitalism. We have every right as a society to ask of that system, is it working? Is it working for us? Do the benefits and the costs balance themselves out in a way that says we want to keep the system, or that says we want to change the system, or that says we ought to look for an alternative system? We've been afraid to ask that question. We've been afraid to have public debates. That's the legacy of the Cold War. We can't afford anymore to not do that. We have to do as the questioner says, raise the question, as it is put in a very powerful slogan in Germany by a new party that now gets 12% of the national vote. Here's their slogan. It's in Germany. Can Germany do better than capitalism? And their answer is yes. And that has forced the conversation about this system, its limits, its strengths and weaknesses. That's long overdue in the United States. And one of the results of this crisis, and now of this governmental paralysis, is to give a strong impetus to asking those questions. And that doesn't mean accepting the alternatives of the past. The old efforts of going beyond capitalism had strengths, but they also had horrible weaknesses. We will learn from that, as human beings always have, and we can forge a country out of an opening of the debate about this economic system, and I want to be part of that, and I think the American people are ready and interested in doing it as well.
I want to thank you very much for being with us. Richard Wolff, an economist just back actually from Europe, but teaches here in New York at New School University. His book is called Capitalism Hits the Fan, The Global Economic Meltdown and What to Do About It.